Hi. Oh, this really works. This microphone works. Good afternoon. I'm Alexandra Kleeman. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased from Greenlight Bookstore outside on the plaza. The authors will also be signing their books immediately following this program at the signing tables downstairs in the rotunda. Authors, at the conclusion of the program, please go directly to your signing tables. Audience, please clear the room and let them all out to the signing table. So we're lucky to be here today discussing Dystopias of the Patriarchy, of which there are many existent right now, with Amber Tamblyn and Leni Zumas. Amber Tamblyn is an author, actress, and director. She's been nominated for an Emmy, a Golden Globe, and an Independent Spirit Award, and has 3 books of poetry, including Dark Sparkler, also from Harper Perennial. She wrote and directed a feature film called Painted Black most recently, and is a contributing writer for the New York Times and a founding member of Time's Up. Her debut novel, Any Man, came out this past summer, and she has a book of nonfiction essays forthcoming. Leni Zumas is the author of Farewell Navigator Stories and the novel The Listeners, and most recently the novel Red Clocks, which was a New York Times editor's choice. Her essays and fiction have appeared in Granta, The Cut, Portland Monthly, The Sunday Times, and elsewhere. She's received grants and fellowships from the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. We're very lucky to have them both here to discuss their newest books. So I was so excited when I was approached about this panel because I'm a big fan of speculative fiction and dystopian and post-apocalyptic novels in general. But in teaching a course on these things the past spring, I saw that almost all the examples in the genre were sort of subtly and unvoicedly patriarchal. Like women appeared as props in the stories. Women were shuffled around and used to illustrate the direness of the situation we had sunk to. But it really encouraged me to see this amazing, vital, life-filled work come out and explore these sort of alternate worlds in greater nuance and greater feminist depth. So I'm wondering what the origin of these books was for you. Was it something personal? Was it something political happening in the world? Can you tell us the origin story?
Okay. Hey, everyone, and thank you, Alex and Amber. I started writing Red Clocks in the year 2010, which was a time of more political complacency for me as an Obama voter. But I was also dealing with infertility and going to a lot of doctors and reading a lot about the history, which is sort of a kind of terrible history of like the medicalization of women's bodies and the sort of pathologizing of the body that was having trouble reproducing. And so in some of the research I was doing about fertility treatments, I came across the idea of the Personhood Amendment, which has been proposed to Congress, I think, over 30 times since January 1973, when Roe v. Wade happened. And it would grant rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property and happiness to a fertilized egg. And this is an amendment that the Vice President, Mike Pence, is a big supporter of, and Paul Ryan. And so when I found out about this thing that wasn't just a kind of, I mean, it seemed at the time to me a fringe idea, but I've come to realize that it's not fringe at all. I wanted to incorporate that legislation into the world that I was writing about and investigate how it would affect the characters I was writing about.
Wow. I started writing Any Man in, sort of the idea came to mind in the spring of 2015. And the seed of the novel, which looks at a female serial rapist who attacks a group of men, really came from I think one stemming from being an actress, being an actress since I was 11 years old, and all the things or parts that I have ever been either allowed to play or have read, and really missing this piece, as you mentioned, as far as female protagonists are concerned, about creating a character that was wholly ugly and not redeemable. And I feel like that there is always room for redeemability for women, that there has to be some sense of, at the end of the day, we like them, that they are the broken hero. They are, they do these things, if they're harmful, if they're cruel, they do them because they themselves were hurt. They're getting back at a John, an ex-lover, a father, somebody. And I really wanted to, it was like many different feelings were happening at that time in 2015 and 16 when I was beginning to write the book. Not only was it the election year that we just had, but I was also pregnant with a girl. So I sort of had this very violent periphery around me of everything that I was feeling and absorbing and then writing about. And I wanted to create a female archetype that was the accumulation of all of the awful language that we use to describe women, any woman, that she is a harpy, that she is ugly, things that are borderline anthropomorphic, talking about being a bitch or horse-faced, or, fill in the blank of the language we used, and I wanted to create the cumulative monster archetype of what that woman would be, but also what she would do, and how she would act, and then release her out into the world, so that she was literally and metaphorically untouchable by the male gaze. And in this book, she's barely in it. She's very much a haunting, somebody who's an apparition in the background of these men and their stories and their experiences, which was also very deliberate because I didn't want the reader either to be able to define her.
I wanted to see if you guys would be willing to read a short passage so we can get a sense of the rhythm and the voice of these amazing books. So, Leni?
Sure. Waiting for her prescription in the drugstore on the hard little plastic chair under elevator music and fluorescent glare, the biographer takes out her notebook. Everything in this notebook must be in list form, and any list is eligible. Items for next food shop, doctor's necktie designs, countries with most lighthouses per capita. She starts a new one, accusations from the world. 1, you're too old. 2, if you can't have a child the natural way, you shouldn't have one at all. 3, every child needs 2 parents. 4, children raised by single mothers are more liable to rape, murder, drug take, score low on standardized tests. 5, you're too old. 6, you should have thought of this earlier. 7, you're selfish. 8, you're doing something unnatural. 9, how is that child going to feel when she finds out her father is an anonymous masturbator? 10, your body is a grizzled husk. 11, you're too old, sad spinster. 12, are you only doing this because you're lonely? Prescription's ready. Thank you. She signs the screen on the counter. How's your day been? Long lashes turns up his palms at the ceiling. If it makes you feel any better, says the biographer, this medication is going to make me have a foul-smelling vaginal discharge. At least it's for a good cause, he says. She clears her throat. That'll be $157.63, he adds. Pardon me? I'm really sorry. $157 for 10 pills? Your insurance doesn't cover it. Why the fuck not? Long Lashes shakes his head. I wish I could, slip it to you, but they've got cameras on every inch of this bitch.
The small bit of backstory from this is just that the first character in this novel, named Donald Ellis, very much, the book opens with him sort of as the same way that Jane Doe in real life woke up under a dumpster in the Stanford rape trial. So he wakes up and he sees the sky. And then he starts to realize that this woman has left him unable to use his genitals for the rest of his life. And you sort of go down the story of what that experience is like to be completely othered from your body. So this is him coming out of the hospital with his wife, Camilla. Camilla rolls me in a wheelchair down a Listerine-reeking hospital hallway towards the elevator. It's easier this way, they tell us. It will be painful for me to walk for a few weeks. I can't lift my eyes to meet those of the nurses, patients, or doctors as I go, but I can feel them. I am a damaged relic leaving the museum for good. I stare at their shoes, patent leather slip-ons, wedges, I think they call them sneakers, even high heels, all those better, happier feet. What would you like for dinner, Dawn? Camilla asks. Light talk is as good as any other way to begin my death sentence. Steak? Lasagna? All food is a last meal. Fish? Everything leads to my execution. I'll have the fish, please. And Camilla, my dear, can we swing by the bar on the way home? I think I left my body there. The elevator doors open and a woman and her husband step out carrying flowers and balloons bearing the words, "Get well." She stops at the sight of me, gasps, and halts her husband with a hand to his chest. I'm sorry, but are you Donald Ellis? No, ma'am, but I get that all the time. You must have mistaken me for a butcher's block. You must have mistaken me for a skinned deer. You must have mistaken me for some coward. Donald is no longer with us. Donald died reading a poem to a bullfighter. Donald was scratched to death by a peacock. Donald passed away trying to make love 200 meters under the ocean. Donald left this world chiseling turquoise out of rock with his bare hands. Donald's fingers bled to death. Donald swallowed 100 matches and rubbed his body against a volcano. He died instantly. Donald got into an argument with the moon and died instantly. Donald revealed how much he could love and died instantly. Donald met his friend for a beer after work and died instantly. Donald has to explain to his children what happened and will die instantly. Donald will touch his wife's thigh and die instantly. I just want to say, it was so awful what happened to you. You're like all over the news, but just like know that everyone is on your side and like sending you prayers. Donald dies instantly. I am so sorry to ask you this, but would you mind if I got a selfie with you?
Thanks so much. I think those two passages that you guys read are just incredible examples of the sort of acrobatic, omnivorous form that you're finding in these books. Like, Leni, you weave together these passages of historical biography, the sort of rules and prohibitions of the world, and then the most intimate spaces of your characters' heads. Amber, these incredibly funny, imaginative, like, what-ifs, things that Donald could say, the op-eds he writes, the different narrators. How did you find these sort of loose, changing, and vital forms for your books?
I mean, for me, it was I don't think that there's much that I do, whether it is of filmmaking or writing or even acting, that is not informed. I mean, that piece I read was very poetically informed, and poetry is where I came from, even further back than acting, and I started that when I was 11, but I was like the nerd on the school ground that's like, do you want to buy my chapbook for 50 cents? Which is a markup, because it was not great. Let's be honest. So I think for me, I wonder if this is similar for you in the sense of exploring, you talk about like the far-reaching points of someone's head, of like inside of their mind. And for me, one of the great joys of being able to sort of express a singular emotion or something that is fairly straightforward, i.e., are you Donald Ellis? I am, but I would prefer to die right now than talk to you, can be expressed in a different type of language, which in this form is just a series of ways in which he feels he has died. And that, for me, with all of the characters, was just a really fascinating exploration, and to also just look at the different ways in which sexual assault pervades and is pervasive. Those to me were the real joys of being able to craft and create each character and make them feel not only them unique, but the experience of what they'd gone through wholly unique.
Yeah, there's a way of simplifying the victim's experience and saying the thing you'd expect over and over again, but you let them have a little bit more room to wander around within that space.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, I feel like, especially with this type of work, that narrative always focuses, and narrative in the world always focuses on the act of the violence, and not enough care is taken on the violences that happen after the fact. And there are so many. The act of silencing, I mean, just all of it. And the book really, for me as a writer too, I wanted to take that on. I wanted to take on the things that we don't talk enough about, that are still sort of, have not been touched, even by present day media.
Yeah, and I think both of our books have a polyphonic logic that seems really closely linked to that, a kind of, I would actually say almost ethical belief that there's not a single overarching narrative that can govern, all of our lives, and that we actually have to create and maintain and protect the space for a lot of different kinds of voices. And so I bet there's more than one other writer in this room, that question of how do you choose, what angle you're writing from, how do you decide, do I have a single first-person narrator, and what are the consequences of that? And in writing a book about several different women with different experiences and who are impacted differently by a sort of set of regulations, I couldn't imagine having just a sort of single voice. And I think it also, the kind of variety of form that you see in Amber's book, which, one of the really exciting things about this book is that the reader is taken through sort of a very interior kind of monologue or poetic kind of rendering of the inside of one of her characters' heads, and then immediately we go to a series of tweets by actual celebrities, they're fictional tweets, right?
Yeah.
But the celebrities themselves exist in the world, and so the reader brings her, all of that kind of freight of what we, we already think of some of these figures, and we get to interact with that. And, the variety of kind of form and spacing on the page, I think, also invites in a kind of more various experience for the reader. Yeah.
And actually, another commonality there is in the polyphony of voices in each of your books. It takes the emphasis off, I think, what we would think is the main event, either the passage of this legislation in your book, Leni, or in Amber's book, these particularly violent acts. And then we see the characters forming relationships with each other that allow them to support one another and sort of withstand that trauma. What made it important for you to focus on sort of community and relationality rather than the crime exclusively?
I think, well, for me, and this book was finished before the Me Too movement really hit, which is forever insane to me, but also not, because look at the world we live in. Look at the president that we had before the Me Too movement, a full almost year before that. For me, especially when you bring up this idea and the sense of community, I mean, I think that is, in my experience, I can say, the experience of womanhood and my experience on the daily of where I find and draw from as far as support and an allyship and real allyship, and the way in which we get through any difficult experience, patriarchal or otherwise, is by that sense of community, of making sure that you feel held by somebody out there in the world, that you feel held by people out there in the world. And I think that's also just a sort of natural state of humankind, So certainly in my book, there was a lot of those characters gravitated towards each other. But, it also shows people who didn't tell their story for 20 years, and because of that, a predator was allowed to go loose and harm other people in the process, but he was a child, and he didn't know how to talk about those things. And then you have other people who feel like they can have the capacity and space, like Donald Ellis, that character who becomes sort of like a John Walsh of America for sexual assault survivors, and is really able to go out there and confront the conversation, which is twofold, because it's not just about physical perpetrators, it also is about media and a journalistic integrity in a world that in and of itself feels predatory. And so he is able to sort of examine and look at those two things, and you can't help but feel the community and the connectedness between them. I think it's one of the only real things that brings us comfort in some way.
It seems important, too, that your character, who is silent for many years about what was done to him, is himself incarcerated. The question of like the kind of larger systems of punishment and sort of discipline that are at play, and if we only focus on what one individual's responsibility is, then we're taking the responsibility off of those bigger systems. So that character seemed to really illustrate that. For me, sometimes my barometer of where to kind of go, like what territory to write into, is what I'm trying to avoid the most, like what feels like, oh fuck, I don't want to look at that, And for me, that when I was writing Red Clocks, it was female friendship and sort of intimacy and rivalry and competitiveness and jealousy and some of the things that the kind of very complex layers of comparison that can happen in many different kinds of friendships, obviously, but I was thinking just sort of in my own life, like incredibly close female friendships, and wanting to write about the kind of dynamic of judging another person's story silently as you're kind of like having dinner with them, and that of course, I think is inherited from a kind of bigger culture in which we get these stories of like, this is how your life is supposed to go. Like, by this age, it would be good if you had done this, or gotten married, or had kids, or and the ways in which those stories sort of operate on a body that has a uterus and ovaries and a vulva differently from a body that like has a penis. And then how we, as the kind of actors in those friendships, are like supporting each other and loving each other, but also wondering, like, should I be doing that? Like, what if my life's not as meaningful as hers because she's doing this? And so in not all, but in some of these characters, I was able to kind of find a way to put those silent judgments in a room together and kind of see what happened.
And it really pays off, because I think the richness of those relationships is so wonderful and gives such an amazing psychological realism to this world. Like usually you have to put so much energy into world building to say like, this world is a little bit different from ours, pay attention to that. But we see the way the world exerts pressure on these individual people, and we see it in how they relate to one another. It's incredibly vivid, I think. In that sense, I was wondering, you're creating these worlds, and the worlds have this connection to our own and to the political issues going on in it. But how do you focus on and get lost in your world when things are changing all the time in the world we live in? Were you ever afraid that reality was going to catch up with these worlds you're creating and render it no longer speculative, but domestic fiction, domestic realist fiction?
Yeah, I have that fear of about September 20th when the Kavanaugh vote happens, because, I think the world, like having my book set in a time that is kind of exactly like our own, except that abortion is now illegal again, as are some kind of certain fertility procedures, and only married people can adopt children now in this book. When I was choosing those things, I chose everything from existing proposals, like laws that had been, either used to be true or current lawmakers were trying to make them be true again. And obviously the Supreme Court is one of the mechanisms that would support that happening. And so, when I was revising this after November 2016, it made me look at, I was really so depressed for a while that I couldn't work on the book, because anytime I would read a scene that was talking about, this 15-year-old girl going to Canada to try to get an abortion and then getting arrested at the border, it felt too just kind of gross to work on. But then the thing that helped me get out of that fog was to think about, okay, fiction and storytelling and all kinds of literature. I mean, one of the ways that, they do work in the world isn't just saying oh, this is how the world should be, or this is how the world shouldn't be, but it's just to invite you into the experience of, well, what would it feel like if the world were like this? And, maybe it would feel differently to different characters, but to focus on that rather than please don't let this actually happen, And I think, I had a similar experience reading, Amber, your book, because there's such it could so easily be in our world today or yesterday or tomorrow with, very few, if any change. I mean, it would just require that this particular kind of person doing these things, but the way that the press kind of operates in the media, there's no difference. So there's a lot of recognition there. Yeah.
It's interesting that you said that, because I also had to take a break from writing it for about 6 months, which was more of a health issue due to pregnancy that rendered me literally not able to use my hands. I got very severe bilateral carpal tunnel and Decker vein syndrome for about 9 months. But I also think that was my central nervous system sort of responding to the work that I was writing, which was very hard. That's a whole other conversation. But so I was sort of had a forced break, and but also needed it, because I think that it was stirring and made me feel a lot of different emotions. And certainly, when the book was finished in the summer of 2017, and then all the stuff that subsequently happened after that with the Me Too movement and in my own personal experience with all of that, there was a real fear to put it out the next year, to put it out sort of so closely. And I remember, I think we announced it in February of 2018 of this year, and then the book came out in June. But there was a conversation with my editors at Harper Perennial to just say, are we sure right now is the right time to do this? And it really felt to me like there may not be any other right time to do it, because people are so exposed to the conversation, and it's going to force media, it's going to force journalists and interviewers and those people who are hired to create articles for clickbait, and the kind of language that they use and the imagery that they use. It's going to force the reporter who is constantly putting Rose McGowan and Harvey Weinstein's photo together in their article and re-traumatizing her, and the millions of other versions of the Rose McGowans in this world, male, female, non-binary, no matter the gender. It's going to force people to look at how they are actively complacent and complicit within the work that they are trying to do to be helpful. And so I felt like as long as people read the work for what it was, which was not trying to misappropriate the experiences of those who identify as female, but to look at it, and not to look at it as a gender switch, which in so many interviews I had to instantly sort of correct that narrative, which is just, one journalist reads the next person's interview, and very few really do the homework. And I had to keep saying, it's an expansion of the conversation. And there's no way that we can sort of address, I think, in my opinion, I don't think we can fully address the epidemic of sexual assault and harassment, which always stems back to lack of representation and power imbalance and abuse of power, unless we are what we preach, which is truly inclusive. And that means we have to be inclusive of all of the conversations and all of the different types of people that are not only being affected, but also this idea that trauma begets trauma, and that there's this reciprocal, continuation of harm that people, human beings, all kinds, continue to do to one another.
I mean, the passage that Leni pointed out was especially interesting to me in that, you do such a good job satirizing and plotting out all the possible takes that different Twitter users and then different media outlets will have on one of these violent assaults. How do you think we can help the discourse push past these reflexive and sort of unhelpful re-traumatizing?
Well, I think one of the most important things is that we are responsible for our own inflictions of pain and our own damage that we create, which means any one of you can, I should be very clear that there's a long section, this Twitter section, is not just, the Westboro Baptist Church and the far right and the Proud Boys, but it's also the Women's March. It's also very liberal organizations and people who mean well, and in the attempt of trying to help, they are actually just sort of adding to what a larger problem is. And so much of that is really about us taking the moment, and look, we're in Brooklyn. We're in the capital of people who care, who give a shit, who do what they can to try to help. That is not all places all the time, but this idea that we can just get on our phones after we take a shower or whatever and scroll through, and you see something that it upsets you, and there's a hashtag trending that'll help, and you can quote retweet it and use the hashtag, and you've done your work for the day. And you helped out that organization, that individual, that community. You did it. Good for you. And that's the bullshit that we have to be more cognizant of, I think. And we have to not think that just social media is our activism. When I say we, I'm definitely talking to the white people in this room. I should say that. I should be very clear. Because I think that that's the simplest form, is for us to be able to just say, this is how we can help, instead of being in communities, going, to the areas in which we live in and try to affect change, whether that's on a policy level or otherwise. And so the Twitter sphere, this whole thing shows, I think, when it's not scrollable, when you're not doing this and it can't just be ignored, I think its permanence on the page is almost like a reflection back to us of our own laziness, of our own complicity. So I hope that is what that section provides. And there are also some really wonderful, there's Roxanne Gay's in there, and everything she says to me is always perfect. So, of course, it's she says the perfect right thing. She's amazing. But then you've got other people who are well-meaning, and doesn't come out right. And I have been that person a million times fold.
Well, in going from the book to the world, I think that it's always hard to trace a direct causal relationship between the politics of a piece of literature and the political effects you want to see in the world. What are you hoping your books will do for readers, for the larger community, for people who may not even read the whole book, but may hear about it and be touched by an idea in it? How do you want your book to enter the world?
Yeah, in a way, it's a hard question to answer for me, because when I wrote the book, and in general, whenever I'm writing something, I'm not thinking about wanting to have a single message or single effect on someone. I think if I were thinking about that, it would constrict so much what I was doing, because for me, when I start writing, I have a lot of questions and maybe a sentence or an image, and I don't know how this character is going to end up. I kind of just, and when I'm saying that, I don't mean to say that it's an apolitical process in any way, shape, or form. It's more about knowing versus questioning, or already knowing in advance versus being curious about something, being curious about someone who's in a marriage that she doesn't want to be in. It's not that I know, okay, I want the reader to understand that this is a bad way to live. I don't think that's what fiction does or should do. And if it does do it, then it's kind of coercive, and this it's like hitting us over the head with a hammer. But that said, it is a different question when the book's already in the world. I don't know. I think I would love for people to read it, and maybe continue to be curious about an experience that they haven't personally had, but could have or might have, or someone they love might have, rather than only focus on what's relatable. Because I think I'm also a teacher of writing, and so sometimes when I talk to students about what relatability means, there's a lot of different things that means. It's not just you had the same experiences I've had, so I like you, or you're confirming what I already believe the world is, so I like you. It could be more like this character who's fighting in World War I feels loneliness in a way that I'm really curious about and like want to know more about, and where does that loneliness come from? And so I had someone ask me at a reading I did in Washington, D.C., like, the guy who had clearly, like, not read a word of the book, but he's like, my evangelical Christian relatives are being attacked by your book, so, what do you say to them? And and I think it's that kind of soundbite, tagline, like, one-sentence way of understanding things that is kind of what fiction doesn't fit into. It's like you actually have to read a book rather than just know, oh, it's attacking someone. So what about you, Amber?
What was the question? Oh, right. So deep into that.
The question is,
Yes, no, I got it. Okay. Yeah, I think in the simplest idea is I hope that the book resensitizes people to the conversations around sexual assault and also degenders them. I think those two things are really important.
That's great. I want to open it up to questions from the audience because I'm sure people have many. So do you have a question for either Leni or Amber?
Hi. I really enjoyed the presentation. My name is Raymond Lotta from Revolution Books.
Hi.
And I wanted to just to sort of pursue this line of discussion. And I was provoked by Leni's opening remarks that she was, feeling the complacency of the Obama years in 2010, and here we are today. And the discussion just now is focusing on how does the book enter the world, interact with the world. And what I wanted to ask is, have you, Leni and Amber, not reevaluated, but sort of reflected on what is the role of the artist in extraordinary times like these? In other words, here we have a fascist regime in power seeking to impose a Christian theocracy and make America white again. There's never been a more dangerous, perilous moment in our lifetimes. So in these extraordinary times, and what you were etching out in the back and forth here, have you kind of reflected or thought differently about your role, as an artist? However the book enters into the world and is contested, do you feel a special responsibility that's perhaps different than how you were thinking in that complacent period that you mentioned?
I think I've become more keenly aware of how artists, I'll speak, I live in America, so I'll talk about America. I'm not sure how this plays out in other parts of the world, but despite the kind of rhetoric of freedom of expression that we have in this country, art making is a function of capitalism, right? And so the ways in which each of us participates in that, like, there's some choice involved, but there's a lot of things that aren't chosen. Everything from who can afford to go to college or go to an MFA program to whose father's friend works in publishing, and so they know the right person to talk to. And the reason I bring those things up is because, sure, I think actually a lot about wanting to, some of the best conversations I've had around Red Clocks have been with women and men actually, who were of reproductive age before 1973, and kind of what their experience. I met a woman whose sister almost died from complications of a homemade abortion, and kind of understanding that, like, that's really meaningful, like, for me to listen to those stories and participate in them. But also, I've had a lot of luck as an artist because, you know, I managed to get published at all. Like, a lot of great work doesn't get published. And so it's hard to think about responsibility without, like, I wouldn't want to ever put it just on sort of the individual effort realm. It would more be about all of us continuing to have conversations about how publishing works, and race and class in publishing, and sort of distribution of books, and who editors, you know, those kinds of questions too. So I guess that's a partial answer for you.
That's a good answer. I think for me that the only, I think it's very important for me to allow and create in my mind to be able to go to the deepest, scariest lengths and spaces that it needs to go to in the subconscious. At the same time, it was very important for me, especially in the writing of this book. One of the characters is a trans man named Michael Parker, and it was very important in my research and telling that story that I wasn't, again, being a hypocrite and doing more harm than good in telling that story, which is not a story that I know, and it's not my story. So that, to me, I think, was an area in which I took a lot of consideration, and I spoke to some friends and did a lot of diligent research to make sure that I was sending the message that I was trying to send, because his story happens in that large body of tweets and is told only through the tweets. He's one of the only characters in the book that you don't hear him from first-person narrative, which is a point. He's sort of silenced in the book. But I think that it was important for me, knowing who my readership is, to remember, again, how we do that. Even when we are liberal and we think that we're woke and we're helping, sometimes maybe we're not. So I think that was like a real, that was very much at the forefront of my mind a lot while reading this book, and making sure that it was honest, and that if it was going to be something like that it had something to say.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
This might be too abstract a question, but how do you balance trying to confront the reader from their fantasy and our anger with drawing on people's empathy, in a gentler approach?
Right. So the problem of reconciling anger and confronting the reader, but then also inviting empathy, is that, yeah? God, I don't know. Because I mean, so in the more than 2 decades in which I've been writing fiction, what I have noticed in my own process and just in reading other books is, like, if I, like, the attempting to kind of control the reaction of, you know, like, oh, if I do this, then the reader will feel connection or empathy, or if I do that, you know, the reader will be alienated. I think for me, it hasn't been the best road to go down, because I think there's a lot of that fear-based, like, oh, well, what if someone thinks this, and what if, you know, and again, it's not that those questions don't come into it, but in a first draft, I think trying to kind of design that or control it, at least for me, hasn't really worked. But I think what does work is the question of, okay, where am I falling into lazy, kind of predictable received ideas? Where am I using a stereotype? Am I using a cliche? Because those are the things that, to me, like, kind of erase empathy, because they're making everything sort of prepackaged and in a way everyone's seen before, and then we can't feel it anymore. So the more that we can kind of give the reader a more jarring or jolting experience, I think there's more emotional connection to be had, even if there's more alienation. I happen to know from a website called Goodreads that some people think my book is confusing, you know? I mean, and that's gonna happen. So if I had said, okay, Leni, like, you don't want to confuse a single reader, I would have written a different book, right? And maybe had more Goodreads ratings, you know? But I like your question a lot, because I think the idea of audience and connection and accessibility and versus alienation, like those are important to think about. I think it's a question of when, like at what point in the drafting process also do you look at that?
Yeah, it is a really great question. For me, it was twofold, just as far as looking at, I think most men have a really great ability to sympathize, and I don't think that they have a great ability to empathize. And most men, again, I'm not saying all, but part of the experiment of this book for me was saying, if I can show who I think you are, those types of men, in this world, especially in this country, if I can show what I think that the deeper emotional value is and what your interior life is like, I think a part of, which is so much a part of masculinity and something that is, I think, told to a lot of men that they are not really allowed to show. When you read that, if you are a man, you might feel empathy towards seeing yourself in that book. And then the hope is that that will also create empathy for the real world in which that conversation is happening with a different gender. So I don't know if I ever thought about a way to do it. I think that was the way that I did it for this particular book. I know for Dark Sparkler, which was a book that looked at the lives and deaths of child star actresses. I think that was also just about, again, humanizing people, humanizing the experiences of people in general. And I think if you do that, and you definitely go to the places that, you get out of the cliches, and you make sure that what you're writing has something really different to say, important and different to say, I think that you will provide the natural empathy to a reader. That's the way that I felt anyway. I know that with the Twitter section, there was a journalist for the LA Times, and the first thing she said to me when she interviewed me was, "This book really hurt my feelings, and it remains one of my favorite books I've ever read. How did you do that?" And I was like, I just told the truth about who you are, and I showed it to you. I think without being cruel about it. I just thinking being as honest as you can without trying to be vindictive perhaps provides some level of authentic empathy.
And with that, thank you so much for coming.
I wish you had a gavel.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you guys so much for coming. The authors will be signing their books in the rotunda downstairs. Books are for sale with green light out in the front. And bring your name cards to the table as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right.
Bring your own name card.
That was great. Thank you. It was really nice conversation. Yeah.
There's really interesting. Hi, Karina. I saw you.